Page 132. In this page we zoom in the mitzvah of Mila on Shabbat, which is the previous page. Yesterday and day before we dealt with Machshirei Mila, which means all the preparation for the brit, for the performing of circumcision on Shabbat. Now we're going to the mitzvah of Mila itself on Shabbat, and there are many questions soon you see involved with the Brit Milah itself. So that's the main key of our discussion today. We are on page Kuf Lamed Bet 132, 6th line from the top of the page. Since we discussed Machshirei Milah, which all the preparation for the Brit, now we are about to focus on the facilitation of the Brit Milah itself. Since we discussed the Machloket, the dispute between Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer in yesterday, Ad kan lo plige Rabbanan alei, ela b'machshirei milah, aval milah gufa, divrei hakol docha et Shabbat. So the Ritva explained to us that what it meant up to this point. Our discussion was only in regard to preparation, all the involvement of preparing the milah. But now, since we cannot do it before Shabbat, and therefore it's override the Shabbat, so they said menalan. How do you know that the mitzvah to do Brit Milah it's override the Shabbat? Because basically we all know that the Torah warned us many times to observe the Shabbat properly, and the Torah said in via negativa, in a positive way, in both ways the Torah said that we have to keep all the 39 rulings when it's come to Shabbat. Now all of a sudden the rabbis tells us that the mitzvah of Brit Milah is override the Shabbat. Now if you look at the mitzvah of Milah, on the surface it looks like a violation. What type of violation? Anybody knows what's the violation of Shabbat, if it may, by Milah? Remember we discussed it yesterday?
The actual circumcision could be cause injury.
Oh, so that's called very nice.
Blood injury, yeah.
Correct. That's called chovel. And it's the subsequent is derivative melacha of shochet.
Oh, right.
Shochet, meaning
is slaughtering, yes.
Slaughtering is forbidden. It's 139.
Yeah.
So that's the question. Omar Ula.
Now, what about the actual cutting? Is that the act of cutting the? That's
exactly what we're about to discuss. The question is, how come you're allowed to do some type of injury on Shabbat? Even it's the smallest infinitesimal, but still it's some type of injury.
Now let me ask you this though, and maybe this is even a little bit Kabbalistic, but is it also considered striking a final blow? I'd heard
Makiba Patish?
Because that makes the boy perfect at the end. That finishes him, completes him.
No, the opposite. You know that in the army, in Israeli army, they have a definition of health. So someone like me, when I went through all the process in order to be accepted in those paratrooper units, so they make me perfect, which is 97%. The 3% no soldiers get if he's Jewish, if he's circumcised. Which means
interesting.
It cannot be perfect in a regular health definition since part of you was taken, the foreskin. Anyway, Amar Ula, so Ula responded and he said, Halakha, as you know, what is halakha? No gil. You know what is halakha? Halakha meaning, we believe that when the Torah transmitted in Sinai, so Moshe Rabbeinu, when God told him, build a sukkah, so we believe that God also explained to him the size, the heights. It's called halakha leMoshe Sinai. Several rulings that we believe it's for Moses and Sinai, which means if you search in the entire text of the Torah, you cannot find anything clearly written there. But in a Masoret, in our tradition, we believe what it transmitted orally from generation to generation from Moses that you receive from God, that's the halakha, which is that מילה override Shabbat. וכן אמר רבי יצחק, הלכה. Rabbi Yitzchak also approved it, and he said it's halacha transmitted to Moshe Rabbeinu from Sinai. So now we ask the question. There is a famous GEMARA in Yoma 85. The GEMARA said, Meitivei minayin lepikuach nefesh shedoche et Shabbat. So the question first is not only on Shabbat. It's how do you know that in order to save a person you can do other violations, right? So the GEMARA use a Shabbat as an example. Why? Because the Shabbat is a very serious Avera, we call it Avera Chamura, that it's a very serious, and therefore, since the Torah said that someone violated with Eidim, Chayav Mita, Skila, etc., that it's one of the most stringent in the Mitot Bedin. So therefore, and since the Brit Milah, it's considering a covenant, and Shabbat is also considered Od Brit, a covenant, Beini Uven Bnei Yisrael Oti Leolam, that's a Brit, that is a covenant between Hashem and the people. So someone who intentionally violates Shabbat has the same din as Mumar. So therefore, here we reach a point of Pikuach Nefesh, of saving life. That's very common, that people may enter the domain of violation of Shabbat for someone who is ill, dangerously ill. So therefore, the question is, what pikuach nefesh, what saving life, when and where and how it overrides the mitzvah of observing Shabbat. But you should know that there are exceptions. The GEMARA said in Yoma 82 that there are 3 mitzvot. It's part, by the way, of the 7 Noachide laws, that even saving life not override that negative mitzvot, which is, anybody knows, avodah zara, worshipping idols, gilui arayot, which is how do you call it, family relations, prohibition against relation within the immediate family, incest, thank you, and also shfichut damim, spilling of blood, killing. All these violation, which is also part of 7 Noachide laws, the pikuach nefesh, saving life not override them. So now the GEMARA asks the source from Yoma, how do you know that saving life is not override the Shabbat? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah explained, and he said, we learn it from Kal Vachomer. How? מה מילה שהיא אחד מאיבריו של אדם דוחה את השבת, קל וחומר בפיקוח נפש שדוחה את השבת. If מילה involve only with one limb of a person, yet we say that that's override the mitzvah of observing Shabbat, so how much so if anything that involve with saving life of a person that has to override Shabbat? That's a simple, logical way of thinking. Ve'is al kadeatach. And if you tell me halacha, if you tell me that that's a halacha le Moshe Sinai, which means that the whole idea that the source of Mila, that it's override the Shabbat, is a tradition that we receive from Moses in Sinai, it's an issue. Why? Kal v'chomer mehalacha mi'ate. If it's halacha, which means that was the tradition that transmitted since the time of Moses, so you cannot learn from that the whole derivative of kal v'chomer, that from now you understand that when it's come to other saving life issue, you go ahead and save life and it's override the Shabbat. Rashba, Ritva, Ran have a very different school of thought. They hold that since the Brit Milah, the covenant of circumcision, it's one mitzvah in the person's limb, and it's override the Shabbat, how much so saving life, that if a person has his entire body, how many mitzvot he or she can fulfill. And therefore, if you tell me fulfilling one mitzvah override the Shabbat, fulfilling many mitzvot for sure it will override the Shabbat. But that's a different school of thought. So now we bring a source that we cannot bring a kal vachomer from something that is halacha leMoshe Sinai. Some word of introduction. If a Nazirite, if someone, he is commit himself to be a Nazirite, and he attach a corpse, partially or fully, let's say even for small part, so he need to wait a certain period, which is 7 days, and at the end of the 7 days, beginning of the 8th day, he needs to bring a special offering, and he needs to do all the procedure, and that's the way you do it. Now we learn that even he touched a very small, minute part of the corpse. He touched even a size of, let's say, of fig size, or the very small seorah. So what we learn from that? We learn והתניא אמר לו רבי אלעזר בן עזריה עקיבא, רבי אלעזר בן עזריה said to רבי עקיבא, עצם כשעורה מטמא הלכה ורביעית דם קל וחומר ואין דנים מקל וחומר מהלכה. He said to him, think about it. If you have a bone of the size of a grain barley, which is such a small, tiny, minute size, yet it can transmit tuma, a ritual impurity, and that's halacha transmitted from Moshe Rabbeinu in Sinai, and you'll derive it from even a quarter log of blood, which is a very small amount, and transmit the tuma, based on what? On kal vachomer. So, and you will not, does not derive a kal vachomer from halacha leMoshe Sinai, which means they said it here in a very clear way. Rashi explained that halacha leMoshe Sinai is considering oral teaching, and since it's the oral teaching, it was not transmitted to derive by the 13th principle we learn from Rabbi Ishmael. That 13th principle, it's not part of the decorum, part of the transmission that we have to derive from the oral teaching, the 13 principles. The 13 principle apply to the Torah itself. So now the GEMARA accepted that question and tried to bring a source why a Brit Milah has to be at the 8th day, and therefore it's override the Shabbat. Ela Amar Rabbi Elazar explained, Atya ot. You remember we talk about ot as a sign. So since you use the word ot twice in the Torah in 2 locations, and you remember Gzera Shava, which is you juxtapose the 2 sources to learn one thing. So since they said in the book of Shmot in Exodus 31, Achet Shabdotai Tishmoru, you shall observe Shabbat, because it's a sign between you and between God and the people. And then they said in Bereshit, in Genesis chapter 17, Unmaltem et besar olachtem v'aleot brit beni uvenechem. You shall circumcise your foreskin, and it will be a sign between me and you. So it means that Shabbat is a proper time for the Brit, which means that Brit Milah overrides Shabbat. Ela me'ata. So now if you say that the oath, it's transmitted in Sinai to learn in the Gzera Shava, in a comparison, תפילין דכתיב בהם אות לדחי שבת. Since it's written in tefillin that it's a oath that shall be signed for the hand of you between your eyes, so therefore it should be override Shabbat and they should be done on that day. Ela, the idea that Milah override Shabbat, Atya Brit Brit, because it's written twice the word covenant. Once the Torah said La'asod et Shabbat ledorotam Brit Olam. They said in Exodus 31 they shall make a Shabbat for the future generation a everlasting covenant. And they said in a Brit Milah, in a circumcision, V'haya le'ot Brit, it should be a circumcision covenant between me and you. So you learn that comparison using that word of Brit twice, that Shabbat is a proper time to do Brit if it's occurred on the 8th day. So, and you learn from that the circumcision overrides Shabbat. Excuse me. Now we go ahead and ask another question. You remember the story in the Reishi that said that Ishmael was circumcised at the age of 13. So what happened if Gadol, if you have someone who's considering a mature, and what is mature? Someone who passed 13 years and one day he is already bar mitzvah, and he turned that they didn't circumcise him when he was a baby for all kind of reasons, and unfortunately it happens, and now he come to circumcise himself, which means he either hire a moral or Avraham Avinu, you know. So the chtiv beibrit, because they said, the Torah said covenant, right? Why the Torah said that someone who has a foreskin and didn't do it the way I asked, that soul shall be cut off, he violated my covenant. That's what the Torah said there. So therefore, lidchei Shabbat. So if that happened on Shabbat, if he's at 13 years and one day, he should, that mitzvah should override Shabbat. So what do you prove from that? That the word brit, which means covenant, it's not come to teach us a juxtaposition of two sources to compare one to another. Ela, the whole halacha, that brit override Shabbat, atya dorot dorot. They tried to find another word. They said the word dorot, meaning generation, twice. Because in Shabbat, they said on Shmot Lamed Aleph, Exodus 31, La'asod et Shabbat ledorotam. They should observe Shabbat for from future generation, the dor vador. And also in the Brit they said the same source, Bereshit Yud Zayin, Genesis 17, they said Uben shmonat yamim yimol lachem kol zachar ledoroteichem. And if the baby is 8 days old, you should circumcise not just now, but Hashem said to Abraham, that's also applied to what?
Future generation.
Future generation, Rashi said. And therefore, what do you derive? That if it occurred on Shabbat, it's proper time to do it at that specific time, which is the 8th day, and therefore Brit Milah override Shabbat. The GEMARA rejected, and they said tzitzit dechtiv beidorot lidchei Shabbat. So now you can go by the tzitzit, by the ritual fringers. So too, with regard to which we said that the term generation is also written, it should override the Shabbat, and it should be permitted to affix tzitzit, the ritual fringes, to a garment on Shabbat. So they said, in conclusion, Ela amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, danim ot brit vedorot meot brit vedorot. So now we go by all three, wrap it up together. And he said the halacha is derived not from one common word alone, but one derives, it's based upon the three words. They said the word sign, ot, brit, covenant, and the word dorotechem, generations. All these three that appear with regard to Brit Milah, to circumcision, from sign, covenant, and generation, three different words that appear with regard to Shabbat, to do what? La pukeanach dechadu k'dichtiv b'hen. So you learn from that to the exclusion that three, which is the tzitzit, the ritual fringes, and tefillin, that what we said, with that regard to each of them, one of these written, but not all three words together. So therefore you don't derive gzera shava from that. Another source, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, the reason that to do the Brit Milah, it's override Shabbat, it's because Amar Kra Bayom. The Torah said in Leviticus 12, Vayetam'a Shivat Yamin, that the woman that delivered the baby, she is impure, state of impurity for 7 days. Ubayom Hashmini Yimol Besar Lato. Now on the 8th day, they should do circumcision. So since the word Uvayom on the 8th day, it looks like superfluous. So we learn from that, Bayom, which is the 8th day, it will be circumcised. Afilu b'Shabbat, even that happened on Shabbat. Omar l'Reish Lakish l'Rabbi Yochanan, Ela me'ata. If you learn from that, mechusarei kapara dechtiv bu bayom. If the superfluous word of bayom that we learn on the Brit Milah teach us that we should learn the mitzvah specifically that day, and even it occurred on Shabbat. If that's the case, so mechusarei kapara, if those the impure people, those who lacking atonement, so that they need to bring a offering in order to complete the period of the purity, which is all the 4 category. Zav, remember we studied Zava, Yoledet, and Metzorah. Someone who has a discharge, someone who has delivered a baby, and someone who carry a leprosy. Dechtiv behu bayom, and it looks like that word bayom is superfluous, it's not need. Hacheiname dedachu Shabbat. So we derive from that regular offering, their purification override the Shabbat, and for sure it's not. Why? Because the halacha is, when it's come to korbanot yachid, to say the individual offering, it's not override the Shabbat. The Rabbeinu Hanan will explain that only korban like tamid, musaf, additional korbanot, that you can do it, but other than that, no, individual not. So Rabbi Yochanan replied and he said, Hahu mi bailei bayom velo balayla. You derive from that the mitzvah of doing brit has to be daytime and not at night. So now back to our old question, which is, how do you learn that we have to do the brit on the 8th day that occurred on Shabbat? So Rabbi Yochanan responds and he said, Hahu, all the idea that we have to do the brit when on a day and not at night, mi ben shmonat yamim nafka, because the Torah used the word on the 8 days, they used the word yamim. The Torah said, uben shmonat yamim yimol lachem kol zachar. The 8 days yamim, you should circumcise every baby boy. Genesis 17:12. So what we learn from that has to be daytime. Otherwise it's superfluous, it's miyutar, you don't need it. Hainame. So now Reish Lakish come back and ask, what you tell me that those korbanot, those offering of those who are mechusarei kapara would need to have the atonements, has to be during the day and not at night. How do you learn it? Mi beyom tzavoto et bnei Yisrael akriv et korbanehem, because it's written in Leviticus chapter 7, that it has to be by Yom Tzavoto, that specific day that God commanded. Nafka, we derive from that line that it's that all the offering only offered during the day, and that including what? Mechusarei kapara, those who lack of atonements. That's incorporated with the word Bayom Tzavoto. So now Rabbi Yochanan respond to that, and he said, Afal Gav, the Nafkaran Biyom Tzavoto, even we derive from that word that it has to be that day that he commanded, it's tzricha. They also needs to speak about the offering for those who have a lack of atonement. Salka de'ata chamina, you may think, ho'il v'chas rachamana leila etuil bedalut, the Torah had compassion upon people, especially people who have a lack of, better term, bad mazal, or someone who involved with great expense. Because think about it, if someone is a poor indigent person and he committed a sin, and now this poor person needs to bring an offering, and that offering costs him tremendous amount of money, and he really cannot afford it, he doesn't have credit card, right? This is one of the worst things that happen in our society. I can't tell you, when I'm doing counseling for people, how many people lost so much because of this card, because they misuse the credit cards. It's a nice thing to have banks give you a chance to use more money than you have, but if you do it unwisely, especially if it's not your business, if it's your personal life, that can be a curse. Anyway, so what did the Torah said? If someone is an indigent, they said, okay, Mr., let's call him a name, Mr. Reuven, you cannot afford, but you want to bring an offering, so guess what we ask you to do? Bring only 2 doves instead. Shnei torim or shnei bnei yonah. How do you say dove male?
Doves. I mean,
doves.
Yeah,
fine.
doves. Yeah,
so you have to bring either the male or the female, 2 of them. Which means, excuse me, that instead of the regular animal that the rich person bring. Let's face it, the price of a regular heavy animal versus a little dove is 2 different prices. So that's what the Torah said. The Torah have compassion, because when it's come to a metzora, someone who has a leprosy, he needs to bring a keves, right? 1 for Ola and 1 for the sin offering. And that's in addition to a keves of Hashem. So that's a lot of money, right? So therefore we learn Balayla Name Laite. So he, may you think that he can bring also his offering on at night, which means, what do you think? The same way as the Torah have compassion upon a person, and they said bring something that doesn't cost you so much. So you may think that also it's applied to time management, which means the Torah have compassion on them and said, let's not wait until the morning, you can bring it now even at night. So they said no, Kamash Melan, therefore the Torah needs to tell us the word Bayom. What we learn, that also this specific offering you cannot bring them at night, but only in the daytime. Matkifla Ravina. So Ravina asked a question. Ela me'ata, if that's the true what you said in regard to offering that lack of atonement, that the Torah is more lenient, that someone who's poor can bring, instead of heavy animal, only 2 doves, so therefore Yeheh Zar Kasher Bahen. So guess what? We are lenient, so let's go another stage. You know, it's always a fear when you open the door for leniency. It can be a snowball, can lead to other things. So now you may think that that's apply also to someone who's a zar. What is a zar? Zar, it's someone who's like alienated, was a stranger. Good morning. Was a stranger. So you may say that he also can bring that offering. Ve'yeheh onen, and you say that the Kohen, if they're Kohen, that he lost his loved one, which is if he lost one of his 7 immediate family, so he is in a state of onenut, and if he's in a state of onenut, he cannot bring his offering. So that Kohen, kasher bahen, so that Kohen, you may say that he can bring an offering. Let's a little bit elaborate on that. What is onen? Onen, the category of onen is, no, help me.
It's after somebody passes away before the burial, between the death and the burial. There's your pater from all the mitzvos, because your pater, you don't have to do tefillah or any of the mitzvos, and then subsequent to the burial, you're obligated.
Good, very nice. So let's elaborate on that. Onen, first and foremost, apply only to 7 immediate family, which is his married wife, his father, his mother, his son, his daughter, his brother, and his sister. That's the 7 immediate family. Aninut, it's a language of sorrow. Avel, tar, it's something that is sorrow. And that's meaning that that's a time that the person is an extremely bitter, and he is very upset over the lost one, and therefore there are special halachot applied to that period, such as the onen are not allowed to bring a korbanot, an offering in a Beit HaMikdash, and if he is a Kohen, he went ahead and he brought a korban, his korban is invalid, it's possible. Now, if you go by the Torah, the whole idea of aninut applied to what? Only for the day of passing. However, the Rambam said, after the completion of burial, what's the din? So the Rambam hold that it's apply also further on. Rashi disagree, and he said that it's only up to the time, as David said, up to the time of the burial. Now, according to the final word of the sages, not Torah, sages, they said that this state of aninut, it's continue on not only of the day of passing, but also up to the time of burial. So let's clarify it again. Mr. Reuven passed away on Sunday, and we bury him on Monday. Can be a million reasons why. Maybe it's a hospital approval, signing papers, son that needs to come from out west, all kind of reasons. So originally speaking from the Torah, the point of aninut applied to what? Only on that day, which is Sunday. The rabbis extended and said that the person in a state of aninut until what? Until you go and buried, which is Monday. So now we go to the point that we ask. If you tell me in that sense that the Kohen, maybe he can bring an offering to even he's in a state of aninut. So the GEMARA responded and said, no, ha ahadrei kra. So since the pasuk said clearly that all those offering for those who have lack of atonement, we learn that you can bring them only during the day and not at night. So the same rules that all the other offering, it's pasul laila, you cannot bring them at night. The same apply to all the other that it's not valid. The third halacha, we have here our discussion. How do you know that Brit Milah overrides Shabbat? Since the Torah said so many times, for those who just walk in, the Torah says so many times that we have to observe Shabbat in a very strong language. How come doing injury to a baby on Shabbat, which is look like a chovel, which is tolada of shochet, not allowed? It's override. Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Rav Acha bar Yaakov brought a third source, and he said, we are several lines from the bottom of the page.
Thank you.
Kuf Lamed Bet
Right.
So they said, because it's written Uvayom at the day, so we learn Amar Kra Shmini. The Torah said in Vayikra in Leviticus 12, at the 8th day, Ubayom Hashmini Yimol Besaulaton, the 8th day which was circumcised, which means Shmini Afilu Beshabbat. The Torah said the word Shmini, 8, which means you have to do it Bo Bayom, you have to do it on the 8th day, and therefore, even it's occurred on Shabbat, you have to do the Brit Milah.
Let's say they push it off for medical reasons. Would the issue of Shabbos ever occur? Like, would you ever do it? If, let's say, the baby was jaundiced and they couldn't do the bris on the 8th day, and then they...
Then whenever the doctor said he's ready, you'll be circumcised.
Yeah, but they wouldn't do it after that on the Shabbos. You have to do it on the Shabbos if it's the 8th day, but once it exceeds that, then you don't do it again on the Shabbos.
True.
Right, okay.
So they said, Hai Shmini mibaile lemaute shvi'i. No. You know why they use the word 8th day? It's because they want to tell us that you have to circumcise the baby at the 8 days, not because of Shabbat. So the Gemara responds, no. Shvi'i, the 7, mi ben shmonat yamim nafka. Because the Torah said on the 8 days we derive that, which means what we said, the word Shmini, the 8 days in Tazria, it's something that you can derive, that Shmini can be even on Shabbat. So the Gemara rejected and said, if you go that way, so you go and he said that both verses are still necessary. Why? Because one has to exclude the 7th day and one to exclude the 9th day. So they said, דאם אחד הווה מן השביעי הוא דלא מטה זימני, אבל משמיני ואילך זימני הוא. As if it were derived from one verse alone, I will have said what it is on the 7th day that one may not do the Brit Milah, since the time to do the circumcise the child may not yet arrive and the obligation of circumcision is not yet in effect. אבל, however, משמיני ואילך זימני הוא, from the 8th day and onward is the time, and therefore you think that it's permissible to postpone the Brit Milah until the 9th day. So therefore the Gemara said, Ela machvarta keRabbi Yochanan. So there you have to say that the answer is clear by the way Rabbi Yochanan said, that he explained that the Brit Milah on time, which is the 8th day, override the Shabbat, and he brought it from the word Uvayom, in that day, not from the word Shmini. So if anyone asks you what's the source that Brit Milah overrides Shabbat, from all these 3 different sources, you should know that the source is from the word Uvayom. Tanya Kvatei de Rabbi Yochanan. Now we bring another source to prove what Rabbi Yochanan said. Udelo Rabbi Acha ben Yaakov, that he learned from the word Ashmini. He said, the Torah said in Vayikra in Leviticus 12, Ubayom Ashmini Yimol Afilu Beshabbat, which means always you have to circumcise the baby at the 8 days, even it's occurred at the Shabbat. So now, someone who does a work, a labor on Shabbat, you said, Umani mekayem mechalele amot yumat, since the Torah said via negativa that one who violates Shabbat should be put to death. So they said, Bishar melachot chutz b'milah. So now, if you speak about other type of work that he did on Shabbat, that excluded milah that the Torah permitted. Or I know, so maybe not. Ella, you may say the opposite one. What the Torah said that one who desecrates the Shabbat should put to death, afilu milah, maybe even in addition to mani mekayem ubayom hashmini yimol, what we learn from the word that the 8 days we should do the brit, which means all the days excluding Shabbat. So the same conclusion, no, Talmud lomar uvayom, this additional word of the dat day uvayom, afilu b'Shabbat. So on that day, meaning that very day when it turns 8 days old, even on Shabbat. So that's the reason. So you see here that the Tana of the Braita rejects Rav Ada bar Yaakov proof and accept Rabbi Yochanan as that the phrase on that day conclusively establishes that the Brit Milah is performed even on Shabbat. Omar Rava. You have two questions on that. Hi Tana, this Tana and Braita, me'ikara ma'ikanichale, ulvasov makashalei. At the beginning, he said, we learned for Bayom Hashmini Imo, that is specifically the 8 days. And then we changed it, and he said, we learned from the one Mechalele Amot Yuma, that one who violated the Shudat. So he said that if the 8 days occur in a regular day, my kashale, why he returned and he changed his mind from what we said originally. So the GEMARA said, Hache ke'amar, that's the way you should learn. Shmini yimol afilu b'Shabbat. He should circumcise that 8 days even is occurred on Shabbat. Uma ani mekayem mechalele amot yumat. Well, how do you learn that someone who desecrates mot yumat? Bishar melachot. That's applied to what? To other prohibited labors beside the circumcision. Aval milah dachya. However, circumcision overrides Shabbat. My tama. Why? Kal vachomeru. You learn it from kal vachomer, by mean of in fortification, which means that you take the one source that it's much stringent and you compare it. Umat tzaraat. Tzaraat is a leprosy, for better term. So the Torah warned that the person should not lakutz et tzaraat. So he said that shedocha et ha'avodah, which means that leprosy override the temple service, which means the Kohen who is a leper may not serve in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, and it's prohibited to cut off the symptoms of leprosy. You know, part of the obligation of the Kohen is cut off part of that skin. Va'avoda docha et Shabbat. We just turned to 132b, and the temple services override the Shabbat because the Shabbat offering and sacrifice they have to be in a certain time. So he said milah docha ota, which is milah override the leprosy. Shabbat shenidchet mipnei avodah eno din shetehem milah docha ota. So since Shabbat, which is override by the temple service, is it not logical that the Brit Milah, which is so stringent, that override leprosy, override Shabbat as well? So they said, Umay eino dekama. So what do you mean by saying, or perhaps the questions in the previous statement? Hadar Amar umimai de tzarat chamura, the same way as the cutting part of the skin in leprosy. It's that's much more stringent than Shabbat. So perhaps Dilma Shabbat Chamura שיש בה עונשים ואזהרות הרבה. So since Shabbat is more stringent, why? It includes a severe punishment of karet and exclusion of by stoning. So it's many mitzvot, and numerous warning pertaining to in the Torah. Umimai. So how do you know that the Kohen not allowed to cut part of the skin in order to purify and bring the offering? Mishum de chamira tzarati, because we said that the tzarat, the leprosy, is more stringent in the temple services. Dilma mishum gavra udelo chazi. Maybe the reason that the person cannot bring this offering, it's because a man is afflicted with leprosy, is unfit to perform a service, and due to the stringency of the prohibition to remove symptoms of leprosy from one body. So if that's the case, Umani Mikaim Shminiim all Chutz Shabbat. So how do I establish the verse on the 8 days the flesh of the foreskin shall be circumcised? That's applied a day other than Shabbat. Talmud lomar bayom afilu b'Shabbat. So we learn from that the proof that when the Torah states on that day, that indicating that Brit Milah is performed even on Shabbat. So now we ask Tanu Rabbanan Milah docha et atzarat ben bizmana ben shelo bizmana. The circumcision override leprosy regardless if it's on time or not on time. Yom Tov eino doche, because you don't circumcise on the Yom Tov, ela bizmana bilvad, only when it performed when it's appointed time, which means if it's not on time, that later the GEMARA said in the next page the Ritva said that's we bring the source. So they said how do you know that the mitzvah of Brit Milah, it's regardless if it's in time or not in time, override the prohibition of cutting a leper? The Tanu Rabbanan, we said in Vayikra in Leviticus chapter 12, Yimol besaro lato, you should take off the foreskin, part of the foreskin. So because they said in general term, Yimol besaro lato, ve'af al pi sheyesh sham baheret. So even there is a situation that they have there a bright white leper's spot there, so if they have this type, yakotz, so he should cut it, and then umani mekayem hishamer b'neged tzarat b'shar mekomot chutz b'milah. So now I establish the verse, take care with regard to the plague of leprosy. They said it this in the Deuteronomy chapter 24. So what we learn from that? Bizman b'shar mekomot chutz b'milah. That applies in all the other places other than the place of the Brit Milah, obviously. Or eno ela afilu milah, or perhaps that's not the case, rather the prohibition applies even the place of the Brit Milah. Umani mikayim yimol besaro lato. And how do I validate the verse? The flesh of this foreskin shall be circumcised. Bizman she'ein ba baheret. It applies when there is no bright white leper spot on the foreskin. But if it's baheret, you cannot do the Brit Milah. Talmud lomar besar. So the verse stage, they say the superfluous word besar, a flesh. So we learn from that word, ve'af al pi sheyesh sham baheret, that even though there is a bright white spot there. Omar Rava haytana meikar ha'maynicha lei ulvasof ma'ikasha lei. So Rava say initially, what did the Tana find acceptable, and ultimately what it did find difficult. So they said, that's the way you should understand. This is a verse should say, Yimol besaro lato v'af al pi sheyesh baheret. You should do the circumcision even they have that bright spot, the white spot there. Umani mekayim yishamer b'neged tzarat. And how do you learn the idea of you should be careful with the leprosy, you should not cut it? Bishar mekomot chutz b'milah, in any part of the body excluding the place of the brit. Aval milah docha et atzarat. But how do you know that the circumcision override leprosy? My tama de'atya mikal v'chomer. You learn it from mikal v'chomer, which means soon you see the source. Uma Shabbat chamura milah docha ota. Tzara lo kal sheken. If Shabbat is such an important mitzvah, yet milah overrided. Tzara, that it's relatively light, much lighter than Shabbat, for sure that the mitzvah of circumcision overrided. Umay o eno dekama. So what it means, the reason for the term perhaps that the Tana is saying to question his previous statement, Hadar Kamar, Mai de Shabbat de Chamira. Here he considers and said, from where do we know that Shabbat is more stringent? Dilma Tzarat Chamira. Maybe leprosy overrides the temple service. as we said, שכן דוחה את העבודה והעבודה דוחה את השבת. Because the temple service override the Shabbat, and therefore we learn, Talmud לומר, בשר ואף על פי שיש שם בערד. So we learn from the word flesh to teach us that the foreskin is removed even though there is a bright white leper spot over there. Lishna Achrina, another source in the Braita, Mila דוחה את הצרת. The Torah said that we should, Yimol Besar Olato, you should do the brit foreskin as a certain commandment, which means that that's including a situation that is a tzarat. Ma'itama, what's the reason? When you have a choice between a positive and negative commandment, asem, the positive, which is the brit milah, Yimol Besar Olato, and the lo ta'aseh, the cutting part of the leper, Hishamer b'neged tzarat, the aseh, the positive override the negative. You know the Kamar. So why the Tana went back? Hadar Kamar. When we say that the positive aseh, you should do it, override lo ta'aseh greda, which means a general negative commandment. Hai aseh velo ta'aseh, but this one is a both positive and negative, because they said in one hand you should be careful in the tzarat, in leprosy, and then they said in Vayikra 13, ולעשות את כל אשר הורו אתכם הקונים עליהם אשר ציוויתים. You should do what they tell them, which is as assess, so it's a combination of two. ומה אני מקיים ממול בשר לתור? How do I fulfill the mitzvah of you should circumcise the foreskin בזמן שאין בה בהרת? That's apply only if in the foreskin there is no any white spot. תלמוד לומר בשר, ואף על פי שיש שם בהרת. You learn the word בשר, that it apply even that they have some type of white spot that it should cut together with the brit. So teinach gadol dechtiv behu basar, that will be a walk out well with regard to circumcision of an adult who has not yet been circumcised. But as the word flesh is written with regard to adult verse, right? They said ve'arel zachar, uncircumcised person. Katan na mektiv bebasar. With the minor, which is circumcised on the 8 days, it's also the word flesh, it's written. So it's look like superfluous. Benoni min nalan. How do you know that if it's a baby, but it's not neither one, which means it's past the 8 days? So how do you know that it's override the issue, the prohibition of cutting the tzarat? Because one appear like superfluous. Amar Abaye atya mi benaya. You learn it from the combination of the two sources about the status of this child, that is an intermediate stage. Why? Because you use the 8-day-old and you reach the majority. So how do you learn it? We learn from binyanav. Sheken anush karet, because if it's a violation, it can be deserved the karet penalty. Mikatan lo atya sheken milah bezmana. So from the minor you cannot be drive. Since the circumcision has to be as a time override the Shabbat, maybe also override leprosy. So they said שכן מילה בזמנה, הצד השווה שבהם שכן נימולים ודוחים את הצרת, אף כל שנימולים ודוחים את הצרת. So the common denominator between the 8-day-old and the adult, that they are circumcised and their circumcision override leprosy, so too all who are circumcised, including those who are intermediate stage, all override leprosy. Rava amar milah bizmana docha. Rava said that milah, to do brit on time, override the prohibition of cutting the leprosy. Lo tzrich hakra mikal v'chomer atya. We learn it from kal v'chomer. How much the Shabbat the chamira? How about the Shabbat that it's a much chamur, much stronger, docha tzarat, lo kol sheken. So we said earlier that it's override Shabbat. Tzarat, if it's come to the more stringent than leprosy, all more so that circumcision override leprosy. Amar le Rav Safra le Rava, mimai de Shabbat chamira. How do you know that Shabbat is more than the cutting the part of the tzarat? Dilma tzarat chamira. Maybe you said that that's much stringent than Shabbat. Why? Sheken docha avodah v'avodah docha the Shabbat. Because if someone has a leprosy, what we said earlier, he cannot walk in a Beit HaMikdash in a temple, And you see that also walking in the Beit HaMikdash override the Shabbat, which means we try to prove that the Tzarat, it's much stringent than Shabbat, much more than Shabbat. So they said, Hatam lav mishum dechamir Tzarat, ela mishum degavra udelo chazi. It's not because the Tzarat is more chamur, it's much stronger. It's because the person is not ready to bring an offering since he carried that issue, that Tzarat issue. Amai, so why you make the Kohen invalid to do this type of work? V'yakotz barato v'yavod. The Kohen should do what? He should cut off that part of the leprosy and let him go ahead and do the work. So the Rabbi explained and he said, no, mechusar tvilahu. What do you have to do after he cut that part? He needs to wait for Arav Shemesh. We need to wait for the past of the day when the sun set, and then he duck himself in the mikveh, and then he need to wait at the end of the day, and only then he can go ahead and bring korbanot. So Rav Safra come back and ask, Tenach negaim tmeim. That's apply to what? Walk well, referring to impure symptoms of leprosy. Even one who removes them must immerse afterward. However, with regard negaim torim ha'ika lemeimar, with regards to pure symptom of leprosy, there is a prohibition to cut off the symptoms even though there is no impurity. So they said, so they have a legal status of blemishes that invalidate the Kohen from serving until he's cured. So they said, Ela amar Ravashi. So for what they said in that case, Ravashi explained, Heicha amrinan de'ate aseh v'lo chelo taseh kol milad de'tzarat. You say that positive mitzvah override negative mitzvah. That's apply like Brit Milah in the case of leprosy, that you do the Brit, even the person carry that in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Milah. Ina tzitzit vekilaim. Alternatively, the tzitzit and diverse kind of wool and linen. So they said that's you violated the kilaim in order to fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzit. The be'ina the mitaker lav mokim aseh. So the minutes, the time that the negative mitzvah is uprooted, the positive mitzvah is fulfilled in very same action, which means the tzitzit are woolen and will be attached to linen garment. So the prohibition of mixture is created. However, hacha, but here, be'ina de mitaker lelav lav mokim aseh. So at the time the negative mitzvah is uprooted, the positive mitzvah is not yet fulfilled. So the Gemara said, V'had de Rava ve'Rav Safra, and this disagreement between Rava and Rav Safra, how do you learn the Brit Milah, the time that it's a override Tzarat, Mode Shabbat, Tanaihi, the Tanya. Just need to finish, we are 133, the top of the page. Tanaihi the Tanya. This is the dispute in Tanaim that is taught in the Braita. Besar, ואף על פי שיש שם בארץ עמו דברי רבי יהושע, רבי נתן אומר אינו צריך. So we say that if even though there is a bright white spot there, one should circumcise. That is a statement of Rabbi Yoshia. Rabbi Yonatan said that there is no heed from this diversion that the word flesh in the verse. Rather, the same law can be derived by mean of Kal Vachomer. So they said Rabbi Yonatan Omer אינו צריך שבת חמורה דוחה צרה לו כל שכן. So if circumcision override Shabbat, which is stringent, all the more so that override leprosy. So אמר מר בשר אבל פי שיש שם בארץ עמו דברי יהושע, למה לקרא דבר שלא מתכוון ודבר שלא מתכוון מותר. So remember we discussed דבר שלא מתכוון if there is an unintentional act is permitted, which means you do something and you do not intend to do something else, and if that happen, it created you are exempt because you don't intend to do it. So consequently there is no heed for a special diversion in this case. Now we're going to practical halachot. We learn today several halachot. The first one is a famous Rambam in Hilchot Milah, first chapter, and also Shulchan Aruch Yoredea 266. Milah docha et hatzarat, circumcision override leprosy, which means circumcision over if there is a bright white leper spot on a foreskin, and the child is circumcised even though cutting the bright spot is a violation of negative mitzvah. Another thing is Yom Tov eina docha ela bizmana bilvad. Performing a circumcision on the 8th day overrides Shabbat and all the more so festival. On the contrary, performing a circumcision at any time after the 8th day, like David asked, does not override Shabbat or festival.
Karetu